Hey everyone, welcome to the Ethics Essay Clinic. I am Eric Matheson. I am a professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto Scarborough. I mostly work in bioethics, but I work in other ethics areas too. In this video, I'm going to set up a series of videos that I'm going to do on how to improve your philosophy essays, in particular, how to write better ethics essays. The goal of this series is to give you a sense of how a professor or somebody who's grading your work will look at it and make a decision about what the grade should be. In later videos, I'm going to go through student papers that have been graded for my courses, and I'm going to walk through in detail what is good about the paper, how the student could have improved, to give you a sense of when somebody's grading your paper, here are the things that they're looking for usually, and that will give you a sense of how you can do better in the future. So the first thing that I think is really important is that when students come from other areas, they haven't taken a philosophy class before, they've never taken ethics before, and they're trying to figure out how does a philosophy paper work. There are a few things to keep in mind. And the most important one is that the conclusion that you reach is actually not the most important thing. And what I mean by that is that the person grading your paper is not going to think that you need to get to some specific result. In particular, they're not going to think that you need to agree with them. So when I grade papers, I have views about bioethics topics. Sometimes students write papers that agree with the views that I have, whether the student knows it or not. Sometimes they write papers that disagree with the views that I have. And that is not really a factor in the grade. So I think sometimes students feel like if they know the professor's view on a topic, then they should write a paper that agrees with the professor's view, because disagreeing kind of feels strange. But actually, that is not the case. And sometimes it can be worse to do that, because if you simply kind of just agree with what the professor is saying and you don't really give an explanation for it, or the danger is that you're not going to really kind of develop your own view. You're going to be stuck in just kind of repeating what the professor says. The other thing to keep in mind as I explain this is that in this series, I'm going to talk about argumentative papers. And by that, I mean that in an argumentative paper, you, the student, are arguing for a particular view. You are giving us your opinion on the matter, and you're trying to convince us, the reader, that your opinion is correct. So this is different. Not all philosophy assignments are like this. Sometimes the goal of the assignment is just to describe somebody else's work, which is also hard to do. That is its own skill, to read a philosophy paper or read an academic article and try to figure out what the argument is. That's a skill to develop as well. And in an argumentative paper, that's sometimes a part of the process. Being able to, if you're responding or objecting to somebody else's work or defending them, you need to be able to give a clear description of what they're saying. But the first thing, if that's a part of the process, then you need to get clear on that. But the focus in what I'm going to be talking about is eventually you getting to the point where you're making your own argument. Here is what I think, and here, reader, is why you should agree with me, although you wouldn't exactly put it like that. So in an argumentative paper, there are 4 components that I am looking for and that I think that most people grading philosophy papers, professors or TAs, are looking for to figure out if you've done a good job. The first and most important quality of a great paper is clarity. A paper in philosophy, the thing that philosophers prioritize over everything else is how clear your argument is. And this comes in a few different kind of levels. So part of it is like early on, do we understand what you're trying to do? Is the objective clear? Have you made a clear thesis statement? Have you explained what it is that you're doing? The second part is like at the very micro level for each sentence. Is it clear what you mean? Are there ambiguous phrases? Are there points, or how many points in the paper do we go, I'm actually not sure if you meant this or if you meant that? The more of those that there are, then the less clear your paper is, and it means that the less likely that we'll be able to follow your argument. So you want to be able to explain it as clearly as possible. Another type of clarity is in the structure of the paper. So as you move paragraph to paragraph or section to section, is it clear to the reader why each paragraph follows from the one that came before it? And if there's a jump or if there's some kind of transition that doesn't really make sense at first to the reader, then that's the sort of thing that you'd want to fix in the editing process. Nobody is going to just sit down and write a perfectly clear paper. When I write papers now, I'll write stuff and then I'll look at it later on and go, oh, this sentence is just totally unclear, or it's ambiguous between these two things. Or I made this jump because I got distracted, or I started thinking about something else and I kind of went on this tangent. So it's not to say that you're just going to produce beautifully clear writing as you go through the process. That's what the editing process is for. So most importantly, clarity, clarity, clarity. Even if that means that your paper, the writing isn't quite as beautiful, or you have to add in some extra words, or you feel like you're just kind of belaboring a point or really hitting the reader over the head with what you're trying to say, that is fine. Better to err on the side of being clear, making sure that you're getting your point across in the clearest way possible, than to leave it up in the air. Another thing that, philosophers sometimes say that philosophy papers are not novels or not short stories. In particular, it's not detective fiction where the paper has not worked well as a philosophy paper if we don't know what your point is until the very end. You shouldn't leave us in suspense. Say what your view is as clearly as possible, right up front, and all the time. Don't kind of hold back. You want to be making the point as clearly as possible. The second thing that we look for in an argument is creativity. So there are so many different ways to argue for the same view. And part of philosophy, in terms of making interesting arguments and finding new points that people haven't thought of before, is finding creative ways of making points. Can you make connections between different views? Can you give an analogy in an interesting way that we haven't thought of before? That's how philosophy makes progress, is by connecting things and by noticing stuff that people haven't realized before. So you can write a paper, and it can be a successful paper in that the argument works. But if you're just doing the same thing, making the same point that other people have made, or maybe taking the point and maybe extending it, but only a little bit, then all else equal, that's not as good of a paper because it's not as creative. So finding new ways of making an argument, or whatever your view is, finding some new connection or some new conclusion, that all else equal, that's more interesting and better. So we've got clarity and creativity. The last two I'm going to do kind of as a package. The first one, or number 3, is the difficulty of the argument. And the fourth one is the execution of the argument. So I like to think about this like diving, like springboard diving, or any kind of platform diving. And most judge sports are like this. But if you think about a diver when she's choosing her dive, one component of the score that she's going to get is how difficult her dive is. So if she's doing a really easy dive, but executes it really well, then that's good because the execution is important. But it's not as good because it's an easier dive. So when you're thinking about writing a paper, what you're trying to do is figure out the balance between the difficulty of the argument and the execution, whether you can actually pull it off. So imagine your thesis is something like, whenever you want to have ice cream, it's wrong to steal from somebody on the street to buy that ice cream. Okay, so the thesis statement is it's wrong to steal from somebody on the street just because you want to get ice cream. That is a really easy argument to make. It's not going to take a lot of kind of complex apparatus. Pretty much everybody is going to agree with you right from the start. So the difficulty of that argument is pretty low. Now, you might be able to execute it really well. You give a convincing argument, which you should, because that's not a very difficult argument to make. But because the difficulty is so low, even if your execution is great, your grade is not going to be that high. You can think about it the other way. Think about something where the difficulty is really, really high. So you gotta like flip the case or find something that is really difficult to argue for. Now, all else equal, that is gonna make for a potentially more interesting paper. But if you can't pull it off, if your execution doesn't work, then that's the equivalent of a diver trying to do a really complicated dive, but ends up just belly flopping into the pool. So you got to get the balance right, where in a paper of the length that you have, and kind of given your what the topic of the course is, and kind of what you can avail yourself of, how much time you have, what the resources are in the course, what you're drawing on. Think about this balance. You might think about an argument and think, oh, okay, well, I think I could argue that that's true, but it's not a very difficult argument, or it's not a very interesting point to make. And so even if I can execute it pretty well, it's not going to be as good. So let me think, can I find a more interesting or a more difficult argument and see if I can pull up that one off? And you keep kind of thinking about, okay, well, how difficult can I make this thesis while still being able to execute it well? And that's the sweet spot that you're looking for. Altogether, we have those 4 points: clarity, creativity, difficulty, and execution. I would say that clarity comes first because everything else that follows depends on us, the reader, being able to follow what you're saying. If we can't follow what you're saying, then even if you have a great point, it's not going to come through on the page. It's not going to come through to the reader. So we're not going to be able to assess it as well. All the other ones, creativity, difficulty, and execution, there's no kind of one that gets priority. You have to find the balance of all of them and to make sure that you're developing the argument well in order to pull it off. So with that in mind, in the next video, I'm going to look at a paper and walk through it in detail and apply these principles.